Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 19th, 2021. Today I'm going to be taking up a series of questions that I've received in recent weeks, all that come down to a basic point. How can the United States and the transatlantic governments trust nations such as Russia, China, Afghanistan under the Taliban to engage fairly and openly in trade agreements, economic agreements, peace treaties, and so on? This is a question I receive quite often. And I think the thing we have to look at is twofold. One is, how would we expect those countries to trust the United States and the NATO countries, given what we have been doing with waging endless wars, regime change operations, sanctions, and hostile acts? But secondly, more importantly, how do you get beyond the existing stalemate, which exists because of the domination of world strategic affairs by a grouping, a financial grouping, a political intelligence grouping centered in the City of London and Wall Street, which believes they have the right to determine the so-called rules of the rules-based order? That's really where the problem lies. And to open the discussion, I'd like to bring up a very short statement written this morning by Megan DeBroat from the Schiller Institute, which I think encapsulates the issue I want to discuss. Here's what Megan wrote in our briefing lead today. History making is a creative act. The civilization which survives and progresses is that which decides to break from the follies of the controlling modes of behavior which lead them toward their chosen doom, and adopt instead a new mode of thinking and acting which is in coherence with the laws of the known universe. As seen in the action of discovery of the scientist or artist, this act of leadership is not something limited to an elite or chosen class. As the founding of the American Republic asserted, statecraft is a task, a duty of the creative mind which lies in potential inside every human being, every citizen. Now, that's a fairly profound statement, which goes toward addressing the question the way Lyndon LaRouche talked about it. And what is it that LaRouche meant by axiomatic systemic falsehoods? Well, let's take a look at some of these falsehoods that exist, which shape the discussion in relations between nations. For example, in the era of the war on terror, the assumption is that you can defeat terrorism militarily, that you emphasize war, military buildup, alliances against the so-called terrorists, counter-terror activities, spying, which includes spying on your own population. Has this worked? Well, not when you recognize that those who are running the war on terror include the same grouping that's arming the factions of the terrorists. Those, for example, the so-called moderate rebels in Syria. Or where did the Taliban and Al-Qaeda come from? From the U.S. arming of them, the CIA arming of them during the war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. What about the role of overthrowing governments, imposing sanctions, and so on? The people running the war on terror are actually creating the conditions for more terrorism. Now, the proper approach, which the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement has always taken, is the adoption of something called the Peace of Westphalia, which is a principle that was applied to end the 30 Years' War in 1648, which was a series of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, but which devastated whole villages and towns and countries. The idea was that there should be a mutual recognition of the legitimacy of other governments and the principle of non-interference, the carry out of trade, cultural exchange, and so on, based on the idea that people have an inherent right to the sovereignty of their nation, but that where there are differences, there can be negotiations and discussions. Now, to take this example further, this is what's needed now in the case of Afghanistan, which faces a devastating economic collapse after 40 years of war. Hunger is stalking the population, disease is rampant, and the policy of the United States continues to be withholding the funds of the Afghan government, which are absolutely essential for the government to be able to buy food, to buy medicine, to carry out some kind of infrastructure development. Now, the Peace of Westphalia was based on the Judeo-Christian application to statecraft of the Golden Rule, as presented by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Mutual respect, act for mutual benefit, and expect that you'll get a return from that. That, as opposed to vengeance or revenge, is the Christian concept which the leaders of nations at war in 1648, after actually it was more like 100 years of war, but the so-called 30 Years' War, they ended it based on returning to that principle of the Sermon on the Mount. This is something which the British and the oligarchs have never accepted. And the most recent assault on that began in 1999 with the Satanic Tony Blair giving a series of addresses in which he said that the era of Westphalia is over. And he said that's because there are forces that are irrational and you cannot discuss things with. Well, what did Blair do? Blair was the one who, with Sir Richard Dearloffe of MI6, drafted the dossier which was used by the Bush-Cheney administration to go to war in Iraq, based on the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had that could reach London within 45 minutes or less. Turns out it was a completely fraudulent dossier, a dodgy dossier for which Sir Richard Dearloffe continues to have either himself or his protégés crank out, as in the case of the Christopher Steele dossier. What's the purpose behind it? To allow a superpower, which is asserting its unilateral rights to impose rules, to attack any government which doesn't submit to giving up its sovereignty and accepting the order that comes from the economic and military power, and is backed by military force. We have had endless wars as a result of the Blair Doctrine. And so the idea of a rules-based order, based on arbitrary rules enforced by the most powerful nations, over and above God's natural law, that's why we've had the disorder in the world that we've had in recent years. Now, to address this, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has initiated something she's calling Operation Ibn Sina. And this has to do with the stabilization and reconstruction of Afghanistan, releasing the funds of the Afghan government that are held in the United States, which the Biden administration so far is refusing to release, based on the idea that unless the Taliban respects human rights and acts in accordance with conditions from other countries, the funds should be withheld from them. Well, that's a form of theft. It's a form of warfare. You lose a war militarily, why then continue to impose suffering on people who have nothing to do with what the Taliban did 20 years ago? We're not even sure if the Taliban is the same Taliban as it was 20 years ago. That's something we have to find out. And countries that are providing some aid or talking about aiding Afghanistan are not talking about recognizing the Taliban. They're talking about recognizing the humanitarian crisis that faces the 30+ million people who live in Afghanistan. The idea of extending humanitarian aid to stabilize the country is not supporting the Taliban, but recognizing that the alternative is that if you punish the government with sanctions, with withholding funds and so on, it's a death sentence to millions who are malnourished and disease-ridden, who lack food and medical supplies, and will become either corpses or migrants if this is not addressed. To do this, to continue on this path, will lead to chaos, will lead to mass death, to terrorism, and an expansion of opium production. The idea of the Ibn Sina project, Ibn Sina was a famous doctor, an astronomer, a scientist, a philosopher, who lived in the 11th century. He was a towering figure in the Islamic Renaissance, and many of his medical writings were used until the 18th or 19th century because of their accuracy and their insights into the nature of human life. By adopting this Project Ibn Sina, the United States would be breaking with a series of failed systemic axioms, which is that you can bully or force governments to accept your will by wars or withholding aid and support. Now, this is something which is an urgent question. This is not a philosophical debater's point. We've seen what happens when you drive countries to desperation, and they have no option but to allow their countries to be used by terrorists as launching grounds. The question then is, how do you break with those axioms? Now, here's an example. Remember, Russia lost a war in Afghanistan, a very costly war, tens of thousands of lives of dead and wounded, very expensive. It played a leading role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the Russians are now delivering tons of food and medical supplies to Afghanistan. Yesterday, the Ministry of Defense of Russia shipped 36 tons of food, medicine, and essential goods to Afghanistan, with 2 more deliveries expected to follow, for a total of more than 100 tons. Now, more could be done in this direction through the extended troika, which is Russia, China, the US, and Pakistan. These nations met in Islamabad, Pakistan last week, discussed the whole question of aid and development, and the new U.S. Representative to Afghanistan, Thomas West, flew after the meeting in Pakistan to Moscow to talk with the Russians. This could be the beginning of a promising shift, and not just a shift, but a fundamental break with the axioms, which essentially say that they are our enemy and we're going to bring them to heel by standing on their necks. That's the policy that was adopted by the Bush administration, that was continued by Obama. It was mixed in the Trump administration because President Trump ran on a platform of opposing these wars, and yet the military-industrial complex acted against his efforts to end them and made it impossible, maybe not impossible, but made it extremely difficult to break from them, although the Trump administration did negotiate the terms of withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, whether you like the way Biden did it or not, it was a potential break from the idea that you can use military force to impose people to accept your will. Now we have an opportunity to work with China's Belt and Road Initiative, to work together with Russia, with Pakistan, with other neighbors of Afghanistan, to relieve the humanitarian threat there and make it a model through Project Ibn Sina for what can be done with Iraq, what could be done with Syria, with Lebanon, with Yemen, with Libya. These are countries which have potential to stand on their own. In fact, one of the reasons they were attacked was because they were standing on their own, going against the City of London, Wall Street, imperial rules-based order. That was why they were targeted. Their leaders targeted for assassination. Their nations targeted for destruction. What was their crime? Trying to improve the lives of their citizens. Maybe they didn't do it in a perfect way. Which nation at this point is perfect? Are we perfect? Look at the negotiations in the Congress right now with hateful recriminations being cast back and forth. Is that the example of Christian statecraft? So LaRouche's proposal was always that we achieve peace through development, through carrying out projects of mutual benefit, of respecting the other, of learning their culture so that we can understand how they think and what shapes their expectations. This is something which we haven't done in a very, very long time. We've been caught in the regional wars going back to Vietnam, to support for imperial tradition. Now is the time to break with that. And it means taking power away from the financial institutions and their related military-industrial complex accomplices to set the United States back on the path of a Republican foreign policy as envisioned by our founding fathers. So that's my update for today. I'll see you again next week.